The story is told of a man driving a cab in downtown Charlottetown. New to the city, he wanted to find a good place to eat. He leaned forward, tapped the cab driver on the shoulder and said, "Hey, buddy." Immediately, the driver let out a blood-curdling scream, lost control of his cab, jumped the curb, managing to get stopped just inches from a plate glass window of a very popular pub on Grafton Street. There was dead silence in the cab, except for the sound of two hearts beating like bass drums. After a moment, the shaken driver turned around and said to his passenger, "Man, you scared the living daylights out of me." The passenger was also shaking as he sat there, white as a ghost, in the back seat. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't realize tapping you on the shoulder would scare you so badly." The driver smiled faintly. "It's not really your fault. You see, this is my first day driving a cab. For the last 25 years, I drove a hearse." I suspect that many people, like the cab driver, have been surprised by the unexpected presence of life, especially when they've become accustomed to the presence of death. Living as we do this day, entombed by the global pandemic of COVID-19, many people are struggling to envision life beyond the potentially death-dealing and life-destroying virus. Asked to self-isolate, to separate ourselves from friends and loved ones so that we can help to slow the transmission of this virus and help save lives. We know within us levels of fear and anxiety that can threaten to increase panic and smother hope. Amid shifting economic and social realities, we seek to ground our spirits in life's essentials. Ezekiel the prophet had prepared himself for the presence of death. He'd watched Israel spend a lifetime rebelling against God. He'd seen how the Israelites had rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian leader who had taken charge of Israel. He knew that the temple in Jerusalem, the most sacred of places, would soon be in rubble. Ezekiel's despair is so great that waking or sleeping, he sees only death. He sees only his sisters and brothers struggling to survive and to cope in this time of exile. It would take the intervention of God's Spirit to help him see life the other side of death, for himself and for his community. In a vision, Ezekiel finds himself staring at a valley of dry bones. Then he hears God calling him to infuse these dry, lifeless bones with the very breath of life itself. God's message is clear. These bones will not live by themselves. Ezekiel's presence and his belief in community will be critical to the presence of a resurrected people. The same would be true for the community that had known Lazarus, his friends, his family. They had been there as he passed from life to death. They had done what was expected of them. They prepared his body for burial. They'd entombed his remains. They had set vigil to grieve and to acknowledge his death. 4 days of vigil passed amid the heat and the stench of the desert sun. Many had let go. They had acknowledged with their tears and their grief the death of their beloved friend. Mary and Martha had stayed. They wanted their brother restored to life, back as he was before death. They wanted the joy and the goodness that they had known before. Jesus would arrive. He would stand at the graveside and he would weep with them. Then he would call his friend to a life the other side of death. He did so with 3 actions. He asked the community to take away the stone from the grave that had entombed Lazarus. He called Lazarus out of the tomb, and then he invited the gathered community to unbind Lazarus, to let him go. I want to suggest this morning that both the story of the Valley of Dry Bones and the Lazarus story place before us images of resurrection life. They're not stories of life restored, of an individual or a community brought back to life from death to be who they were before they lost their life spirit. And maybe therein lies the challenge and the invitation of both these stories. Resurrection is not life restored to what it was before the experience of pain and loss. Resurrection is renewed life, life forged from death and forever changed by that experience. We need to remember that the risen Jesus, the risen Christ, did not look or act as he did before. He bore the scars of his pain and suffering. As we journey closer to Holy Week, as we find ourselves at the cross, standing in the presence of death, as we make our way to the empty tomb on Easter morning, we need to remember that the risen one who stood before his community on Easter morning was not simply the crucified one restored to life. He was the risen Christ. Life, the other side of death, is different. It is a renewed and changed life. To walk through the valley of the shadow of death, whatever that valley may include, is to know we are different people because of the death we've experienced. Like Martha, Mary, and their community, we've all stood outside tombs of death, tombs of betrayal and abandonment, tombs of economic devastation and broken relationship, tombs of physical death and life-changing illness in body and spirit, tombs filled with so much pain and brokenness that we'd rather turn away than begin to envision life the other side of death. These places, these realities change us. Choosing to roll away the stones from the tombs of our hurt and our pain and sorrow, as Jesus asked of Mary, choosing to roll away the stones is acknowledging the death we have known. Standing as he did amid the valley of dry bones, Ezekiel was confronted by the knowledge that his community was no longer who they'd been. Much had been lost. A people now revived by the Spirit of God would not be the same people who had walked into exile. Life, the other side of death, is not just about rolling away the stone. It's about choosing to come out of our tombs when God calls. That was Lazarus' decision when he heard Jesus calling. Theologian Jan Richardson writes this: "Nobody goes into the tomb to pull Lazarus out. No one crosses in his realm to haul him to the other side of living. Lazarus had to choose whether he would loose himself from the grave, its hold on him, his hold on it." See, Lazarus could have chosen to stay dead. Finding life the other side of death can often be so painful that we actually choose to retreat inside the tombs of our hurt, letting go guilt and addiction, letting go woundedness. There's a part of us that seems to want things as they are or as they were. We keep a death grip on the familiar, even when the familiar hurts. Lazarus did not know what coming forth from that tomb would mean. Would life the other side of death would be like? Would the community welcome him with his brokenness and scars? Would they welcome the one who was so changed by what he had known? So too for the Israelites to whom Ezekiel spoke, those survivors of exile making their way back home. What would life the other side of death be for people who were awakening to a new and different tomorrow? Lazarus made the choice to leave the tomb. A risen Lazarus was not Try that again. A risen Lazarus leaving the tomb of his death wasn't sufficient for Jesus. Unbind him, let him go, commands Jesus to the gathered community. Life the other side of death never happens alone. It happens in the context of friends, family, and church. We need one another to untangle ourselves from the burdens and suffering which cling to us, that rob us of the fullness of life to which we've been called. Especially in this time, when we cannot reach out to be physically present to many of those we love and care about, we need to hold and to be held by one another's prayers, encouragement, and gifts. God's promise to the people of Israel was a new spirit, a new life after exile. At the end of the day, we all need to remember that resurrection life is a choice. As we prepare to follow Jesus from life to death to life after death, Ezekiel and Lazarus remind us that life the other side of death is life lived with a God who loves us in life, in death, in life beyond death. A God whose Spirit will help us to roll away the stones that entomb us. A God who will crawl inside our tombs and bless us with a spirit of courage and strength as we wait amid the uncertainty and the unknowing. A God whose love and grace is there in every person, in every action that unbinds us and sets us free to live a risen life. Remember the cab driver? Expecting death, surprised by life. Let us live this week as people willing to be surprised by God's gift of resurrection life.